He thought he was in control the moment the cuffs clicked. But control is a fragile illusion when you choose the wrong person to underestimate. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in restless colors as Officer Daniel Brooks stood tall beside his patrol car, his posture rigid with authority, his voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs gathering around them. And right there against the cool metal surface stood a young black woman who looked like she barely belonged in the moment, her simple jacket slightly wrinkled, her hands held steady, her face calm in a way that didn't match the tension in the air, and yet Daniel saw none of that as anything but confirmation of his assumption, that she was inexperienced, out of place, just another rookie trying to act like she belonged somewhere she didn't. "You picked the wrong place to pretend," he muttered, loud enough for the small crowd forming on the sidewalk to hear, their phones already lifted, their whispers mixing with the hum of passing cars, and she didn't respond, not with anger, not with fear, just silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier the longer it stretches, like a storm waiting for the exact second to break. But Daniel mistook that silence for submission, for weakness, for proof that he was right. And he continued, his tone edged with confidence built over years of never being questioned, never being challenged. "Let me guess, first week on the job? Trying to play dress up?" A faint breeze carried the distant echo of sirens, and for a moment the world seemed to slow, the streetlights flickering against her eyes as she finally lifted her gaze to meet his. And there was something there, something steady, something unshaken, something that didn't belong to someone who was afraid. But again he ignored it, because people like him were trained to see what they expected, not what was real. And as he reached for his radio, speaking into it with clipped certainty, her head tilted slightly, almost curious, almost like she was listening to something else entirely, something beyond the noise, beyond the moment, beyond him. And if anyone had been paying close enough attention, they would have noticed the smallest detail, the way her breathing never changed, the way her shoulders never tensed, the way her eyes didn't dart or drop, but stayed locked, calm, present, waiting, because this wasn't her first time standing in the middle of someone else's mistake. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. This wasn't chaos to her. It was timing. And Daniel, standing there under the flashing lights, surrounded by a crowd that believed they were witnessing another routine stop, had no idea that every second he spoke, every assumption he made, every word he let slip into the night was quietly building towards something he couldn't see, something he couldn't control, something already in motion long before he ever stepped into her path. And just as he exhaled, ready to close the moment on his terms, she finally spoke, her voice low, steady, almost effortless, carrying just enough weight to cut through everything around them without ever rising above it. And in that single moment, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the air itself seemed to tighten, as if the street had realized before he did that the story he thought he was writing had never belonged to him at all. Daniel Brooks felt it before he understood it, that subtle shift in the air that made his grip on certainty loosen just enough to be noticed, not by the crowd, not by the flashing lights, but by something deeper, something instinctive that whispered this moment was no longer following the script he thought he controlled. And yet he pressed forward because that was what he always did, doubling down on authority, reinforcing the version of reality he had already decided was true, his jaw tightening as he glanced at her again, expecting hesitation, expecting cracks in her composure, but finding none, only that same calm expression, the same steady eyes that did not plead, did not argue, did not even flinch, and that unsettled him more than any resistance ever could, because silence like that did not ask for permission, it waited for something else entirely, something he could not name. And he turned slightly toward the growing crowd, aware of the phone's recording, aware of the quiet judgment building in murmurs, and he raised his voice just enough to reassert control, explaining his actions with clipped confidence, framing the situation as routine, justified, necessary, because he had learned long ago that if you spoke like you were right, most people would believe you without question. And for a moment it worked, the tension flattening into something manageable, something predictable, until her words echoed again in his mind, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, deliberate, as if placed exactly where they needed to land. And he replayed them without realizing it, The way a detail sticks when it does not fit the narrative you are trying to build. And his radio crackled faintly at his shoulder, a burst of static followed by a voice that did not sound like the usual dispatch tone, something sharper, more controlled, and he frowned, lifting it slightly, trying to catch the message, but it cut out just as quickly as it came, leaving behind only that lingering sense that something had changed behind the scenes, something he had not authorized, something that did not require his approval, and he exhaled slowly, brushing it off as interference, as coincidence, as anything but what it actually was, because acknowledging uncertainty would mean losing ground, and losing ground was not something he allowed himself to do. Not here, not in front of an audience, not in front of someone he had already decided was beneath him, and yet his eyes flicked back to her again, almost involuntarily, searching for confirmation, for any sign that he still held the upper hand. But she remained exactly the same, posture relaxed, shoulders steady, gaze unwavering, as if time itself had slowed around her while everything else continued to move, and that detail, that stillness, began to pull at the edges of his confidence, because people who were afraid moved, they shifted, they reacted, they tried to explain themselves, but she did none of those things. And somewhere in the distance, barely noticeable beneath the hum of the city, the low growl of engines began to approach, smooth, controlled, deliberate, not the chaotic rush of traffic, but something coordinated, something intentional, and the sound threaded its way into the moment without announcing itself, without demanding attention, yet impossible to ignore once it was heard, and Daniel straightened slightly, his focus splitting for the first time between her and the world beyond the immediate scene. And that was all it took, just a fraction of distraction, just enough for the balance of power to begin shifting in ways he could not yet see, because the truth was already moving toward him, already closing the distance, and for the first time since the moment began, the certainty he had been standing on no longer felt solid beneath his feet. The sound grew clearer now, no longer a distant murmur but a presence that pressed into the edges of the scene, low engines moving with intention, synchronized in a way that did not belong to random traffic, and Daniel Brooks felt his attention fracture again despite himself, his eyes pulling toward the street beyond the flashing lights as two dark vehicles turned the corner with precise timing, their headlights cutting clean lines across the pavement, slowing not with hesitation but with purpose, and something about that movement did not match anything he could categorize as routine, yet his pride refused to let him step back, refused to let him reconsider. So he squared his shoulders and tightened his stance as if posture alone could restore the control he felt slipping, while behind him the murmurs in the crowd shifted tone, curiosity replacing assumption, phones tilting to capture the new arrival. And beside him she remained exactly as she had been, calm, still, watching not the vehicles, not the crowd, but him, as if he were the only variable that mattered in a situation already decided. And that look began to weigh on him, subtle at first, then heavier, because it was not defiance, it was not fear, it was something else entirely, something closer to certainty, and certainty was supposed to belong to him, not her, not here, not in front of everyone. And as the vehicles came to a smooth stop just yards away, doors opening in quiet unison, the air seemed to compress. The kind of silence that falls not because nothing is happening but because something too significant has just begun, and Daniel's radio sparked again. This time not static, but a clear tone followed by a voice that was unmistakably official, steady, controlled, and unfamiliar, calling his badge number with precision that made his pulse hesitate for the briefest moment, and he lifted the radio instinctively, responding with a clipped acknowledgement, trying to anchor himself back into procedure, back into the framework he understood, but the response he received did not follow the usual pattern. It did not ask for clarification or provide routine instructions. Instead, it issued a directive, calm and firm, one that did not invite interpretation, and for the first time his grip on the situation faltered in a way he could not mask, because directives like that did not come from local dispatch. They did not interrupt without reason, and they certainly did not arrive exactly at the moment he needed control the most, and he glanced at her again, sharper this time, searching for something he had missed, replaying every detail from the moment he first approached her, every word she had said, every reaction she had not given, and it began to connect in fragments he did not want to acknowledge. The stillness, the timing, the absence of fear, the single sentence she had spoken that now echoed louder than everything else around him. And as figures stepped out from the vehicles, dressed in dark, composed, moving with the quiet confidence of people who did not need to announce authority because they carried it without effort, the balance shifted fully, not with force, not with noise, but with presence alone, and Daniel felt it settle over the scene like a weight he could not push back against, because whatever this was, whatever had just arrived, it was not something he controlled. It was something that had been in motion long before he ever made his decision. And standing there under the lights, surrounded by witnesses and silence and the slow realization building in his chest, he began to understand that the moment he thought defined her had never been about her at all. It had been about him, and he had already said too much. Daniel Brooks did not move right away, not because he chose not to, but because something inside him had already begun to hesitate, that instinctive pause that comes when certainty starts to fracture. And he felt it now in the way his grip loosened just slightly, in the way his shoulders no longer felt as solid as they had seconds before, and the figures stepping out of the vehicles did not rush, did not raise their voices, did not demand attention. They simply walked forward with a calm that carried more weight than any command he could give, their presence quiet but undeniable, and the crowd that had once leaned toward him now shifted subtly away, as if the center of gravity had changed without announcement. And Daniel tried to reassert himself, clearing his throat, adjusting his stance, forcing his voice back into the firm tone he had relied on for years, but it did not land the same way. It did not carry the same authority, because something in the air had already redefined who held control, and he knew it even before he fully understood why. And then one of them stepped closer, not aggressively, not confrontationally, just enough to enter the space with a quiet confidence that made everything else feel smaller, and Daniel's radio came alive again. The same voice, clearer now, unmistakable in its precision, repeating instructions that left no room for interpretation, instructions that did not align with the narrative he had been building. And for a moment he considered pushing back, questioning it, reclaiming ground through force of will alone. But his training held him in place, that ingrained understanding that some voices carried a level of authority you did not challenge in public, not without consequences. And as that realization settled in, slow but undeniable, he turned his attention back to her, because suddenly she was no longer the background of the situation. She was the center of it, the one constant that had not shifted since the beginning. And now, standing there in the same position, the same calm posture, she looked different, not because she had changed, but because his perception of her had begun to crack, revealing something he had refused to see before. And when she finally moved, it was not dramatic, not sudden, just a small adjustment of her stance, a slight lift of her chin, and the way she met his eyes now carried a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. And in that moment he understood that her silence had never been uncertainty. It had been patience, the kind of patience that waits for the right moment rather than reacting to the wrong one. And the people behind him, the crowd that had once murmured in support of his authority, now fell completely quiet, their phones still raised, but their expressions changed, because they could feel it too, that shift, that invisible line being redrawn in real time. And Daniel's mind raced through every second that had led here, every word he had chosen, every assumption he had made, and none of it aligned anymore with what was unfolding in front of him. And when one of the agents finally spoke, the tone measured and direct, addressing him by name, not title, not badge, but name, it landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it stripped away the shield he had relied on, reducing him to something smaller in a moment that was growing larger than he could contain. And he stood there, caught between the version of reality he had tried to enforce and the truth that was now stepping forward without permission, and for the first time, the control he thought he had never truly existed at all. The name echoed in his mind long after it was spoken out loud, not shouted, not emphasized, just stated with a level of certainty that made it impossible to ignore. And Daniel Brooks felt something shift deeper this time, not just in the moment, but in the foundation he had been standing on, because names were not supposed to be used like that, not in this context, not without a report, not without a chain of command. And yet here it was, spoken plainly by someone who did not need to explain themselves. and the realization crept in slowly that whatever authority he thought he represented was no longer the highest one in the space. And he tried to respond, tried to gather his voice into something steady, something controlled, but the words did not come as easily now. They hesitated, caught between confidence and doubt, and that hesitation did not go unnoticed, not by the agents, not by the crowd, and especially not by her, because she was watching him in a way that felt different now, not as someone being judged, but as someone observing the unraveling of a decision already made, and that difference, subtle as it was, pressed against him with a weight he could not push back against. And as one of the agents stepped closer, holding out a small, unmarked credential that Daniel recognized immediately even without reading it fully, his training filling in the gaps his mind did not want to accept, the pieces finally began to align, not all at once, but in fragments that built on each other until they formed something undeniable, something irreversible. And he glanced back at her again, but this time the look in his eyes was not searching for weakness. It was searching for confirmation, and he found it not in her expression, which remained calm and composed, but in the absence of resistance, in the quiet understanding that she had never needed to fight the situation because it had never truly been against her. And that realization struck deeper than any confrontation could have, because it meant that everything he had done, every assumption he had made, had been unfolding inside a framework he did not control. And the agent's voice came again, measured, direct, outlining details that Daniel had not been aware of, references to an operation, to timing, to coordination that extended far beyond the street they stood on, and each word added another layer to the truth that was now impossible to ignore. And the crowd, once restless and divided, now stood in complete silence, the weight of the moment settling over them as they began to understand that what they were witnessing was not a routine encounter, not even a conflict, but a revelation, a shift in perspective that redefined everything that had come before it. And Daniel felt it fully now, the loss of control not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual realization that control had never been his to begin with. And when she finally spoke again, her voice steady, clear, carrying no anger and no urgency, it landed with a finality that closed the distance between assumption and truth. And in that moment, standing under the fading flash of his own patrol lights, surrounded by people who now saw him differently, Daniel Brooks understood something he had never had to face before, that authority without understanding was fragile, that certainty without truth was temporary, and that sometimes the moment you think you are defining someone else is the exact moment you reveal who you really are. For a long moment, no one moved, not because they were told to stand still, but because the truth had a way of freezing everything in place when it finally arrived. And Daniel Brooks felt that stillness settle around him like a weight he could not shake off, his thoughts no longer racing forward but circling backward, replaying every second that had led him here, every word he had spoken with certainty now sounding different in his own mind, sharper, heavier, harder to justify, and the confidence that once filled his voice now sat quietly behind his ribs, replaced by something unfamiliar, something closer to awareness than fear, because this was not about immediate consequence. It was about realization, the kind that does not hit all at once but unfolds piece by piece until there is no version of the story left that protects you. And as the agents continued to speak, outlining details in calm, measured tones, Daniel began to understand that what had seemed like a simple encounter had never been simple at all, that the woman he had reduced to a role in his mind had been part of something far more precise, far more intentional, something that required discipline, patience, and a level of control he had mistaken for weakness. And that realization shifted the way he saw her entirely, not as someone who had been caught in his authority, but as someone who had been moving within her own, unseen and unchallenged. And the more he listened, the clearer it became that every moment of silence she had held had been a choice, not a lack of response, but a decision to wait, to let the situation reveal itself without interference. And that kind of control was not something he had ever learned, because his version of control had always been immediate, visible, reinforced through presence and voice. But hers had been something else entirely, something quieter, something that did not need to announce itself to be real. And the crowd felt it too, that shift in understanding, the way their posture changed, the way their whispers disappeared, replaced by a collective awareness that what they were witnessing was no longer about a single moment, but about everything that had led up to it. And Daniel's gaze returned to her again, not with judgment this time, but with a searching clarity, as if trying to reconcile the image he had formed with the reality now standing in front of him. And for the first time, he noticed the details he had overlooked before, the steadiness in her breathing, the way her shoulders remained relaxed despite the tension around them, the quiet focus in her eyes that suggested she had already moved beyond this moment even as it continued to unfold. And when she finally shifted her weight, stepping forward just slightly, it was not a move to confront, but to conclude, a subtle signal that the moment had reached its natural end. And one of the agents acknowledged it with a nod so small, it could have been missed, but Daniel saw it. And in that exchange, he understood something that did not need to be explained out loud, that whatever authority he thought he held had never intersected with hers, that they had been operating on entirely different levels from the start. And as that understanding settled in fully, replacing the last fragments of denial, he realized that the most significant part of the moment was not the arrival of the agents or the shift in control. It was the fact that she had never needed to prove anything to him at all, because the truth had already been in motion long before he ever stepped into it. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath of his own assumptions, Daniel Brooks was left, not with resistance or confrontation, but with something far more difficult to face, the clear and undeniable understanding of who he had been in that moment, and who she had been all along. The street did not return to normal, not right away, because moments like this did not simply end. They lingered, stretching into the silence that followed, and Daniel Brooks stood there feeling that silence press against him from every direction, no longer filled with noise or resistance, but with something far more revealing, the quiet awareness of everything that had just unfolded. And as the agents repositioned themselves with calm efficiency, not rushed, not tense, just deliberate, it became clear that the situation had already transitioned beyond anything he could influence, beyond anything he could reframe, and the control he once relied on had not been taken from him. It had simply been replaced by something greater, something that had been present all along without announcing itself. And his eyes moved once more toward her, not out of habit now, but out of recognition, because she was no longer a variable he was trying to assess. She was the fixed point in a moment that had reshaped itself around her. And as she stood there, composed, steady, unaffected by the shift that had unsettled everyone else, he began to understand that what he had witnessed was not just authority, it was discipline, the kind that did not react, the kind that did not need validation, the kind that could stand in the middle of misunderstanding without being altered by it. And that realization settled deeper than anything the agents had said, because it forced him to confront the difference between control that is imposed and control that is inherent. And he saw it clearly now, the contrast between his raised voice earlier, his assumptions, his need to define the situation quickly, and her silence, her patience, her ability to let the moment unfold without interference. And that contrast revealed something he had not considered before, that true authority did not rush to prove itself. It waited until it no longer needed to. And the crowd, still gathered but no longer murmuring, seemed to feel it too, their phones lowering slightly, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something quieter, something closer to reflection, as if they were not just watching a scene, but understanding a lesson. And Daniel felt that shift extend beyond the street, beyond the flashing lights and the presence of the agents, into something more internal, something that would not disappear when the moment ended, because it was no longer about what had happened, it was about what it revealed. And when one of the agents stepped beside her and spoke in a tone that was low but unmistakably respectful, it confirmed what Daniel had already begun to accept, that she was not being escorted, not being managed, but being acknowledged. And that distinction mattered more than anything else in the moment, because it defined where the real authority had always been. And as she finally turned slightly, not toward the agents, not toward the crowd, but just enough to shift her focus away from him, it marked the quiet conclusion of an interaction that had never truly been on equal ground. And Daniel remained where he was, not instructed to move, not physically restrained, but held in place by the weight of understanding that had settled in fully now. And as the vehicles idled and the scene continued to reorganize itself without him at the center, he realized that the most powerful part of the moment was not the arrival of those who outranked him. It was the realization that she had never needed them to prove who she was, because from the very beginning, the truth had been standing right in front of him, waiting for him to recognize it, and he had chosen not to see it until it was too late to ignore. The engines did not turn off immediately, and that detail lingered in the background like a quiet reminder that this moment was still unfolding, still carrying weight beyond what anyone on that street could fully see. And Daniel Brooks remained exactly where he was, his posture no longer rigid but not entirely relaxed either, caught somewhere in between as the last pieces of his understanding settled into place. And the flashing lights that had once framed him as the center of authority now felt almost distant, like they belonged to a version of the moment that had already passed, and his attention shifted again, not out of habit this time, but out of necessity, because everything around him was moving with a purpose he was no longer part of. And she stood there, unchanged in her composure, unchanged in her presence, but entirely different in what she represented now that the truth had surfaced. And one of the agents spoke again, not loudly, not for the crowd, but with a tone that carried enough clarity to reach everyone who needed to hear it, outlining the operation in measured fragments, not revealing everything, not explaining beyond what was required, but enough to confirm what had already become evident, that this had never been an isolated moment, never been a misunderstanding. It had been part of something structured, something deliberate, something that required precision and patience. And as those words settled into the air, the crowd's perspective shifted completely, their earlier assumptions dissolving into quiet realization. Because what they had witnessed was not a mistake being corrected but a truth being revealed, and Daniel felt that realization as deeply as anyone, if not more, because it forced him to confront the gap between what he believed and what was real, and that gap was wider than he had ever considered. And when she finally stepped forward fully, no longer confined to the position he had placed her in, the movement was smooth, controlled, not rushed or emphasized, just enough to mark a transition from one phase of the moment to the next. And the agents adjusted around her with subtle coordination, not leading her, not directing her, but aligning with her presence. And that distinction, quiet as it was, carried more meaning than any explanation could provide. And Daniel watched it happen with a clarity that cut through everything else, understanding now that authority did not always look the way he had been taught to recognize it, that sometimes it stood quietly, waited patiently, and revealed itself only when the moment demanded it. And the radio at his shoulder remained silent now, no longer feeding him instructions, no longer anchoring him to a system he understood, leaving him instead with the reality in front of him, unfiltered and undeniable. And as the vehicles idled and the agents began to shift their focus away from him entirely, it became clear that his role in this moment had already concluded, not through confrontation, not through force, but through realization. And that realization was something he could not step away from, something that would remain long after the lights faded and the street returned to its usual rhythm. And when she paused for just a second, her gaze moving past him rather than toward him, it carried a finality that did not need to be spoken, because everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed. And Daniel Brooks stood there, no longer trying to reclaim control, no longer trying to rewrite the narrative, but simply witnessing the end of a moment that had begun with certainty and ended with something far more powerful, the undeniable presence of truth that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The night did not rush to erase what had happened. It lingered in the glow of streetlights and the quiet hum of engines, holding onto the moment just long enough for it to settle into memory. And Daniel Brooks stood there as everything slowly began to move again, not with urgency, not with chaos, but with a calm that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself was acknowledging the shift that had taken place. And the vehicles that had arrived without warning now prepared to leave in the same controlled silence, their presence fading not as an exit but as a conclusion. And the agents moved with quiet coordination, their roles understood without explanation, their focus already shifting beyond the street, beyond the crowd, beyond him. And she walked with them, not led, not followed, but simply moving forward as if this had always been the direction as if this moment had only ever been a brief intersection in something much larger, and Daniel watched it all unfold with a clarity that no longer resisted what he was seeing, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to reinterpret, only the truth of what had been revealed. And as she passed through the space that had once been defined by his authority, it no longer held the same weight, the same certainty, because that certainty had been replaced by understanding, and that understanding did not come with noise or confrontation. It came with silence, the kind that stays long after the moment has ended, and the crowd began to shift as well, slowly at first, lowering their phones, exchanging glances that carried more thought than reaction, because what they had witnessed was not something that could be reduced to a single explanation. It was something that asked to be considered, to be remembered, and Daniel remained where he was, not because he was told to stay, but because moving too quickly would have felt like avoiding what had just happened, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to stand in that awareness without trying to reshape it, without trying to justify it, because the lesson was already there, clear and undeniable, and it did not need his approval to exist. And as the last of the vehicles began to pull away, their headlights fading into the distance, the street returned to its usual rhythm, the sounds of the city filling the space that had been held by silence. But something had changed, not in the environment, not in the structure of the moment, but in the perspective of those who had been part of it, and Daniel felt that change settle into him in a way that could not be undone, because it was not just about what he had seen, it was about what he had failed to see before. And the weight of that realization stayed with him as the flashing lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, leaving behind only the quiet echo of a moment that had revealed more than anyone expected. And as he finally turned away from the place where it had all unfolded, the thought that remained was not one of authority or control, but something far more lasting, a simple understanding that power does not always announce itself, that truth does not always need to defend itself, and that sometimes the greatest mistake is not what you do, but what you assume before you understand. And long after the street had emptied and the night moved on, that understanding stayed, clear and steady, like a voice that no longer needed to be heard out loud to be remembered.